right, Chapter 12, Property Management. So the first thing you're likely to see as far as property management on the exam is just a basic definition of what a property manager does. Y'all cut the cake? I didn't even get any. Oh, yeah, it's ridiculous. I mean, see how they do? You see?
They don't went in on it.
No. What's that? Now it's probably poison. I don't know. No, I'm just kidding. I'll get it in the next break. So you're probably likely to see the definition, or at least a definitional type question of a property manager. Property manager has two tasks. Number one, maintain the value of the property. How do we maintain the value of the property? By doing what on it? Maintenance. That's one of the major responsibilities of a property manager. The other major responsibility of a property manager is to generate the highest possible return for the owner based on their instructions. Now, we'd love to say maintenance is our number one responsibility, but what's our highest responsibility here? Getting the return on the investment for the owner. Obviously, we want to advocate for doing the maintenance, because eventually if we don't do the maintenance, will that cut into the returns? Yes, absolutely. So those are two major parts of the job. Now you also get a note here of who can't be a property manager in North Carolina. We've talked about a lot of things agency related, and really we've never said a provisional broker can't do something. The only thing that I'm aware of thus far we've talked about that the provisional broker can't do is be a designated dual agent against their who? Their bid. Well, here's the first thing that a provisional broker is not allowed to do. They can't be a property manager. They are not allowed to be a property manager in North Carolina. Now, that's not to say a provisional broker can't work in property management. They can't do property management type functions, but they can't be the property manager. And here's why. If you think back to the agency chapter, when we talked about agency relationships, we said that sales brokers are usually special agents. You remember that? We talked about special agency, general agency, universal agency. And we said special agents have what kind of authority as far as decision making goes? None. Special agents have no decision making authority. General and sales agents are usually special agents, right? General agents have decision-making authority. They don't have all decision-making authority. That'd be universal agency. But they do have significant decision-making authority. Does that make sense for everybody? And we said that property managers are usually what? General agents. So, put those together. A general agent has decision-making authority. Do we want to give decision-making authority to a provisional broker? No. And that's why provisional brokers cannot be the property manager. Now, provisional brokers can certainly do property management tasks like show property and schedule maintenance and all those kinds of things. They can even balance the trust account. They can collect rent. But realistically, you have to do all those things without a license anyway, right? Couldn't an unlicensed employee of a broker do all those things? So a provisional broker can't be the property manager. Remember, the only thing that's required to get rid of the provisional status is to do what? Take what classes? Not classes. That doesn't tell me enough. Post-licensing, not continuing education. Post-licensing, they are very different, and that will kill you on a test. They will interchange continuing education with post-licensing. Post-licensing is for provisional brokers, right? And there's how many hours of it? 90. 3 30-hour classes of post-licensing. And you take all three, you get rid of the provisional status. So you can be, only non-provisional brokers can be the property manager. Everybody okay on that? All right? Now, we want to define this term operating expenses right out of the gate, because one of the biggest things a property manager has to do is to get control over the operating expenses for the property. And because most of this chapter is math, this is going to come in very important when we do the math. because you're going to need to know what line to keep your operating expenses on. What are operating expenses and what are not? Most things that you pay out as part of managing a property are going to be considered operating expenses. I mean, real property taxes, so the property taxes on the property itself, that's an operating expense. Maintenance expenses, that's an operating expense. Any salaries, so if you have an office assistant, if you have a maintenance person, that's an operating expense. Marketing, utilities, insurance, and then look at the bottom one, management fees. Property managers are usually paid some percentage of the rent that's collected. That management fee is also an operating expense. So when we get into the math of property management here in just a few minutes, one of the biggest operating expenses that you're going to have is going to be the property management fee itself. Does that make sense for everybody? Okay, that is an operating expense. What expense do most property owners have that is not on this list? If you look at this list, there's a pretty conspicuous absence, something that's missing that a lot of property owners still need to pay, but is not on this list. The mortgage, it's called debt service. The mortgage payment, it's not there because it's not an operating expense. That's an ownership expense. That goes on a different line item. That is not an operating expense. So there's your first lesson about operating expenses. Mortgages are not operating expenses. Yes, sir, JJ.
Oh, no, I'm sorry.
You have?
It's right.
Okay. All right. We need a property management agreement. Why do we need a property management agreement? Why do we need any agency agreement, like a listing agreement or a buyer agency agreement? To get what? To get paid. This is our contract that entitles our firm to be paid. So we need a property management agreement. It needs to be in writing. It's very similar to a listing agreement. It's going to specify how we get paid, how much we get paid, when we're owed the money. Now, there is a couple of different ways that a property management agreement can specify our compensation. It could specify that we get paid a percentage of rent owed. If you can ever get that deal, you take it. Because the vast majority of the time it's not going to work that way. It's going to be a percentage of rent what? Collected. What's your number one job from the owner's perspective as a property manager? What do they see as your number one job? Collect the rent. And so they're going to want you paid on a percentage of the rent you actually collect. They are not going to want to pay you a percentage of the rent. Oh, well, Miss So-and-so didn't pay her rent this month. They don't want to pay you on that. They want to make sure you have an incentive to collect the rent. Is everybody with me on that? Okay? So it's usually going to be a percentage of rent collected. Notice this is very different than a listing agreement or a buyer agency agreement. When we talk about buyer agency agreements or listing agreements, we said they have to have a termination date. Did we say anything about automatic renewal with those? No. As a matter of fact, we said we couldn't have automatic renewal. But look at this bullet point. It says we should have a termination date, but we could also have what? Automatic renewal. That's different about property management agreements. You can have property management agreements that automatically renew themselves. That's a possibility with a property management agreement. So if you wanted to write one up that says you've been hired for 2 years and then that's going to renew itself unless you give notice. You could almost do it like a lease itself. Okay? That's allowed in a property management agreement. Is everybody okay with that? All right? And it should tell you what exact authority you have. And then really important, this last one, which they love to throw it on a test. The property management agreement should also specify not just your powers and your duties, but how often do you turn the rent over to the landlord, and how often do you provide them an accounting of the rent payments and the expenses. Because remember, your job is to handle all the money. The landlord never sees the rent. You do. Who's going to be, all these things that are on this slide here, who do you think's paying all these things? You are. The property manager is. It's the property manager paying the property taxes. It's the property manager paying for the maintenance. It's the property manager paying the salaries. Property manager paying for the marketing. It's the property manager paying themselves down here. Ultimately, the landlord hired you because they don't want to do that stuff. What they want you to do is turn them over a check. So the property management agreement should specify how often that check comes. Does it come monthly? Does it come quarterly? Does it come yearly? My preference was always monthly. I didn't want to hold the money in my trust account month to month. It made the accounting a lot harder because you had to carry a balance forward and all that kind of stuff. But it's going to really be up to the owner. I had one time just wanted it annually. Wanted one check. One check in December. He's very trusting. Very trusting. Okay, everybody good with that? So that's part of your property management agreement. Now, you should generate a management plan. You need a game plan here. Things to take into consideration, and I like to test you on this little stuff. What's the first thing you should, when you're talking about how I'm going to manage the property, what's my management plan? What do you think the first thing you need to plan around is? Budget, but even back up one step from there. Who owns the property? The landlord. Shouldn't you ask them what they want? That should be goal number one. What is your goal for the property? Because here's the thing. Not every owner has the same goals for their property. Are some owners going to own it and plan to own it for the next 25 years? Yes. Sure. Are there going to be some owners who own it, but they're planning to tear it down in 2 years? Yes. And redevelop it? Is your management plan going to be different for those two owners? How? What's going to differ?
You're not going to try to keep everything in tip-top shape because you're going to throw in new stuff if you're getting rid of it.
If you're going to tear it down. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Well, like for example, well, I mean, it's a very astute observation. So like for example, North Hills. You know, this North Hills corridor, which was right on our back door here, right? You look at those properties in that area that are being sold to Kane Development, for example. If Kane Development comes in and buys a small office building, is that likely what they intend it to be 10 years from now or even 5 years from now? But they don't want to kick all the tenants that are in there out on day one because is it going to take some time for them to get their redevelopment plans rolling? So they need a property manager to manage that property for whatever limited amount of time it has left. But the owner is going to sit down with the property manager and say, don't spend any extra money now. You put Band-Aids on it. If the air conditioning goes out, you spend $500 and get it back going for another 6 months. Don't spend $5,000 on a new one because we're going to do what in a year and a half? We're going to put a wrecking ball of this thing and tear it down in a year and a half. So talk to the owner. Get their goal for the property. That's the number one thing you should take into account with a management plan. It's their property after all. Do an analysis of your competition. You're not operating in a vacuum. You need to know what other people in your area with similar properties are charging. So you have to shop around. You need to comparison shop and see what it looks like. And then you need to do a really good analysis of the subject property, the one you're going to be managing. What are the maintenance needs? What are the concerns? What are the, what's the vacancy look like? All those kinds of things. That's part of your management plan. Another thing you need to do is something called an operating budget. Now, you need to know the difference between an operating budget and a cash flow report. One is a prediction. The other is what actually happened. Which one do you think is the prediction?
The budget.
The budget. An operating budget is something you prepare in advance to give to the owner and say, this is what I think a coming quarter or year is going to look like on this property. Whereas a cash flow report is an actual accounting of what happened. Hopefully they're fairly similar. Does that make sense for everybody? Now when it comes to a cash flow report, you're going to have to learn this formula. And you're going to have to know this thing by heart, upside down and inside out. There is no working around it. There is no guessing around it. You have to know this formula verbatim because they're going to use these terminologies in the test questions. They're going to throw gross effective income at you, or effective gross income means the same thing. And if you don't know what that is, you can't possibly hope to answer the test question. Does that make sense to everybody? This is the way you report income as a property manager. So let's work from top to bottom here. Look at that top line, gross potential income. Does everybody see where I'm at? See, here's the thing about potential. We all have it and none of us live up to it. That's the thing about potential, right? So what do you think gross potential income is for a property? It's completely full, everybody pays, no problems. Does that exist if you're managing 150 units? No, it does not. But it's an important number for one reason. We need a starting point. We need somewhere, because remember, we're preparing a budget. We need to know what is the best case scenario. Does that make sense for everybody? So our gross potential income is the amount of money we would collect if we had 100% occupancy, no vacancy whatsoever, and everybody was paying their rent on time. Fantasyland. It's a unicorn. But it's our starting point. Does that make sense? Because here's the truth. Nobody cares about this number. Nobody. There's not a single party to the transaction. Not the property manager, not the landlord, not the tenant. Nobody cares about this number. It's only important because we need somewhere to start our math from. Does that make sense for everybody? Now notice, there's a very clear trend here. It's always this number minus this number equals this number. Minus this number equals this number. Minus, so what are we doing at every step of the way here? We're subtracting. The numbers are getting smaller because what we're doing is whittling down, taking away money on every stop. Does that make sense? So look at the first stop. It says the first subtraction is what? We're going to subtract what? Vacancy and collection losses. This is where we go from fantasy to reality, because we're going to take the rent we could have possibly collected and subtract out the rent that we did not collect. Whatever rent we didn't collect because the units were vacant or the people didn't pay is going to get subtracted out. Does that make sense for everybody? And then that leaves us with something called gross effective income or effective gross income. It can be said either way, gross effective or effective gross. It still has the word gross in it. When you talk about gross and net, gross means before you deducted expenses, and net means what? After you've deducted expenses. Look at the next line item. Minus what? Operating expenses. So what do you think we're getting ready to do? Change from gross to net. That's exactly what we're doing here. This line item is going to be the most complex one in the formula because there are going to be a ton of things to deal with on this line item. Is a property, especially a big property, going to have a lot of operating expenses? Yes, absolutely. Remember, what is also an operating expense here is your management fee. Don't forget that. So let's talk about that management fee for a second. What do we say it's usually calculated based on? It's a percentage of what? Rent collected, right? Do you see any number up here that looks like rent collected? What is it? Gross effective income. So, here's what I'm telling you. The management fee is an operating expense, but it's calculated based on what? The gross effective income. It's going to be a percentage of that gross effective income. It's on the operating expense line, but it's calculated based on gross effective income. Does that make sense for everybody? Because that's the rent you actually collected. So it's usually going to be some percentage of, like 8%, 9%, 10% of the gross effective income for your management fee. It doesn't come out up here, it comes out down here as an operating expense, but it's calculated based on this number right here. And so that's why we have this number. I said we only have this number because we need a what? Starting point. The only reason we have this number is so we can calculate the management fee. Otherwise, nobody would care about this number. The owner of the property certainly didn't care about this number because this number is meaningless to them because we haven't done what yet? We haven't paid expenses. The only reason this number is important is so that we can calculate the property management fee. Is everybody with me on that? So now we subtracted out all our operating expenses and we equal to what? Our net operating income. Net operating income. Believe it or not, we have still not reached a number that is important to the landlord. We're getting close, but we are not there yet. This is the amount of money the property generates after all the expenses of operating the property are paid. Let me tell you who this number is important to. Appraisers. When we get to chapter 17 and we talk about valuation, you're going to find out that income producing properties are valued based on their net operating income. This line item exists because we need to be able to do an appraisal on this property. And that line item is going to give us a good indication of how much the value of this property is, because this is the money it generates. Does that make sense for everybody? Why does the owner not care about this line item yet? What have we not done? What have we not paid? We haven't paid the mortgage. And as an owner, you only care about what you put in your pocket at the bottom of this thing. Does that make sense for everybody? And so now it's time to finally subtract out the debt service or mortgage payment, the principal and interest mortgage payment. And once we subtract that out, we are left with something called before tax cash flow. Now let me point out one of the common mistakes here. It is called before tax cash flow. We already paid what? Property taxes. It's clearly not before property taxes. It's before income taxes. It's called before tax cash flow because it's before the owner has paid their income taxes. That's the one thing as a property manager you don't have to deal with, thankfully. Because let me ask you a question. Who's going to pay all of these things? The property manager, including the mortgage payment in a lot of cases. The owner wants one check, and they want it to go right in their pocket. They're done. They want this report, and they want a check, and the numbers better match up. That's what they want. This is a cash flow report. Major point, and I should have put it on the slide, but it's not on here, so you need to make a note for yourself. Every number in this formula is an annual number. When we talk about property taxes, we're talking about annual property taxes. When we talk about rent collected, we're talking about annual rent collected. When we talk about a management fee, we're talking about an annual management fee. Everything in this formula is annual. That will not be the case on the questions, though. On the questions, they will very often give you these things as monthly expenses or monthly income. So what are you going to have to do with them? You multiply them by 12. Anytime you see the word monthly, you need to multiply that by 12. If they give you the monthly debt service payment, well, before you plug it in down here, you're going to take that number and do what with it? Multiply it by 12. If they say we have 20 units that rent for $800 a month. Well, what line item would that go on? Gross what? Gross potential income. So on that line we would put 20 times what? Times 800 times 12, because that's monthly rent. Does that make sense? So our gross potential income would be 20 units times $800 a month times 12 months, and there's your gross potential income. Is everybody okay with that? All right, so everything here is annual. And so the big challenge of this chapter is dealing with this formula. What I'm going to show you ways to deal with it. What I suggest always, and this is my coping mechanism, and my students that have adopted it over the years, it has really helped them with this. What I do when I'm doing one of these questions is, first of all, get plenty of room on your paper. You know, if you don't have room, get a piece of scratch paper. Because on every one of these questions, what I think it's best for you to do is to write down the whole formula. Don't write it off to one side, though. Write it down right down the middle of the page. Because what you're going to do is make notes for yourself on one side, and then you're going to do the math on the other side. And you want room to kind of groove and line everything up. So you want to be able to just line everything up. Because you will see in just a second, when we get to these questions, when they start giving you like 20 things that you got to plug in this formula, you need to get them like visually aligned for yourself. Because if you start just trying to do like a tally on a piece of paper, you're going to forget something, you're going to screw it up. Does that make sense for everybody? So when I get one of these questions, here's what I do. But when I see this is what I'm dealing with, I go GPI, which stands for what? Gross potential income minus vacancy equals what? Gross effective income minus operating expenses equals NOI, net operating income, minus debt service equals before tax cash flow. And then as I start working through the problem, so let's say if the problem tells me we have a 20-unit apartment complex and all the units rent for $800 a month. Well, here's what I'm going to write. I'm going to just make notes for myself. I'm not going to do the math. I'm just going to make notes for myself. We got 20 units that rent for $800 a month, so that's times what? 12. And I would just make a note for myself. The complex they have 7% vacancy. So I'm just going to make a note for myself right here on this line, 7%. Because see, what I'm going to do is get all this stuff noted out and then come back and do the math all at one time. And guess where I'm going to do the math? On the other side. I'm going to do the math over here so I can just visually look at what I'm doing. Does that make sense for everybody? You know, it keeps me sorted on a question like this because they're very long. I mean, you talk about verbal diarrhea, you're about to see it big time with these questions. And so you just kind of keep labeling everything out until you're done. You know, everybody good with that? All right, so that's kind of my tool. On the next slide, you've got the basic formula for a property management fee, and it's just the gross effective income times the rate. So gross effective income times 8% times 9%. All right, so what I want to do now is pull out the worksheet that I gave out last night. That is labeled NOI, and it's labeled property management, net operating income, before tax cash flow. And if you want to look ahead, you'll see what I mean about the diarrhea. If you scroll down like to number 6, see how many different things you're going to be dealing with? That's why you're going to need to organize yourself. All right? But number 1 is fairly straightforward. It says calculate the gross potential income. Is everybody good? You got it out? No, you can't have it. Yes, come on, of course you can.
I know it's saying. Are you serious? You know?
Yes. No, she's got the slides. She needs the worksheet, I think. You need the worksheet, right, Michelle? Do you have the slides that we're going over right now? The ones we're just going over? Okay. Here, Michelle. That's the other one I gave out last night. If you buy one, you don't have the other.
She asked me to get her one, you just have one bullet. Oh!
I gave it. We good now? Everybody got one, right? Okay. So number 1 says calculate the gross potential income for a property with 18 commercial units that each rent for $1,250 per month. All right, so gross potential income for a property with 18 commercial units that each rent for $1,250 per month. What's our math going to be? It's going to be 18 times $1,250 times 12, and that's because it says per month, right? Anytime you see monthly or per month, you know you're going to have to convert it to annually. So 18 times $1,250 times 12 months is $270,000 for a gross potential income. Is everybody okay with that? Pretty straightforward so far, right? We good?
Yes.
Okay. Number 12 says to calculate the effective gross income of the above property if 15% of the potential rent is not collected due to vacancy or non-payment collection losses. I'm going to go ahead and start.
Is this number 2?
Number 2.
Oh, I thought you said 12. Okay.
Did I say 12? Number 2.
Okay.
Number 2. Calculate the effective gross income of the above property if 15% of the potential rent is not collected due to vacancy or non-payment losses. I'm already deep into the formula when they start asking me for effective gross income, so let's just get in the habit, because the more you write it, the more you're going to memorize it. Does that make sense for everybody? Let's write it down. So what do we start with? What's the top of the formula?
Yeah.
Gross potential income, and then we're going to subtract what? Vacancy. And that equals what? Gross effective income, and then we're going to subtract what? Operating expenses, and that equals NOI, and then we're going to subtract what? Debt service, and finally that will give us before tax cash flow. Everybody agree with that? Now here's what I want you to do. Go back and look at the question. What are they asking me for? They want the effective gross income, correct? Circle it, highlight it, I don't care what you do, but mark it somehow. You need a destination. And here's why. Right now I haven't done anything tricky to you because these are very introductory questions. But later on, what they're going to do is give you a bunch of numbers that you don't need. Could they ask you for gross effective income but then give you all the operating expenses? Yes. If you haven't organized this thing and kind of marked your stopping point, might you accidentally subtract the operating expenses? Because here's the thing, if I'm stopping here, do I need to know anything below here?
No.
No, it's useless. I'm going to fill it in, but I'm not going to continue with the math of it. I'm just going to note it and say, okay, here's my stopping point, I'm not going any further than that. Everybody all right with that? The other thing I like to do once I mark where my stopping point is, I just kind of put a line across there and say, don't go past here. Just stop. It's like a visual reminder. Stop. You've gone far enough. Does that make sense? Because that's what becomes confusing on this thing. It's not that the math's hard, it's that people go too far, don't go far enough, or put things on the wrong line. Alright, so we want to calculate effective gross income. Here's what we know. The gross potential is how much money? $270,000. And what they told us is that we have 15% vacancy, right? So can I do 15% of 270?
Yes.
So times 15%, I've got $40,500 in vacancy. And that's a minus over here, right? Minus $40,500. Can I calculate my gross effective income based on that?
Wait. Hold on. Yes.
Wait, what? What am I waiting for?
I got to process the question. Okay.
What is the form? You don't have to process anything. If you have to process, you're not reading the formula. The formula simply says gross effective income equals gross potential minus vacancy. So once you've got the vacancy filled in, it's just what?
Subtraction.
Just subtraction. That's exactly right. Okay? So 270 minus 40,500 is going to be 229,500. And that's our gross effective income. Are we all okay with that? That's pretty simple thus far.
So that's, we got 40 with 500, right? Like on glass.
I'm sorry? The
That's
vacancy,
40,500.
the vacancy is $40,500. Yep. The vacancy is $40,500. That's 15% of the 270. Are we all okay on that one? I scroll it up?
Yeah.
All right. Number 3. Calculate the annual property management fee for the property in questions 1 and 2, assuming the brokerage handling the property management account is charging a 10% management fee. 10% of what? What's the property management based on? The gross effective income. Isn't that what we just calculated? So the management fee is going to be 10% of $229,500, isn't it? And so what is that, $22,950? And that would be on what line item? If we were filling it into the formula, what line item would the management fee go on? That's an operating expense. Good. All right, number 4 wants me to calculate the annual property management fee for a 20-unit apartment building where the units rent for $800 monthly and the property has a 10% vacancy rate while the property manager is charging an 8% fee. Again, we're starting to get into the whole lot of verbiage category. So write out the formula. Start at gross potential income and then subtract what? Vacancies. Vacancy and losses are the same thing. And then what does that equal? That equals gross effective income. And then we subtract what next? Operating expenses. And that equals what? Net operating income. And then we subtract, finally, the debt service payment, and that gives us before tax cash flow. All right? So let's just fill in the information we have. Calculate the annual property management fee. So we know our answer is going to be somewhere on this level. Oops, I'm going to do that. On this level right here with the operating expenses, right? That's where we're good. That's where we're headed. We're headed to an operating expense because they want us to calculate the management fee. Everybody with me on that? All right. Calculate the annual property management fee for a 20-unit apartment building where the units rent for $800 monthly. What line am I going to put the 20 units at $800 monthly? GPI. So I'm not doing any math. Don't pick up a calculator yet until you get all this information filled in. 20 units times $800 times what? 12. Because they gave us monthly rent, I've got to convert it over to annual. And the property has a 10% vacancy rate, so I'm just going to make a note for myself, 10% vacancy. While the property manager is charging an 8% management fee. So down here on the operating expense line, I'm just going to put 8% as my note. Because it's just a reminder, that's the math I need to do. Does that make sense for everybody? Yeah? Yes?
I'm just stuck on the GPI as to, I get the formula to break down the 20, the 800, and the 12.
Okay.
But how would I know to put that at the GPI unless I just have to put something there because it's a starting point?
That is your starting point. If you've got 20 units, what's the most rent you could possibly collect if they were all full and everybody was paid, right? So what you need to do is make the connection that the most rent I could possibly collect is if all my units were full and everybody was paying rent.
Okay.
That's where you get 20 units times $800 times 12 months a year.
Okay.
All right? So, we're ready to do the math. Let's figure out the top line. GPI, 20 times 800 times 12. Looks like a gross potential income of $192,000 to me. Everybody okay with that? And then we're going to subtract 10% vacancy. So minus $19,200, because that's 10% of $192,000. Is everybody okay with that? And that equals $172,800. So my gross effective income is $172,800. Notice how I'm trying to keep it all in line so I can clearly see where I am. I'm trying to keep it lined up. That's why I give myself plenty of room. All right, I got a gross effective income of $172,800. What are they asking me for in the question? They want to know what? the management fee, which we've made a note is 8% of what number? 172.8. So, can we take 172.8 and multiply times 8%? And that looks like a management fee to me of $13,824. Well, they don't want us to actually subtract it. They just wanted to know what the management fee was. So, how did it do that? Uh-oh. It blew it up. So the management fee is $13,824, right? Is everybody okay with that? Yes, 172,800 times 8%.
This is how often?
I'm sorry?
This is
What do you mean it's how often?
the,
You mean is it an annual fee? Is that what you're asking?
right.
Yes, everything in this formula is annual.
Annual, that's what you said previously.
So that is the annual property management fee on this property, $13,824. We good? Okay. Yep. The management fee is an operating expense. That's the line item it goes on. You calculate it based on the gross effective income, but it goes on the operating expense line. So you use the gross effective income to calculate it, but then you put it on the line for operating expenses. Yes, ma'am.
So I know you said everything in here in this formula is annual,
Yep.
but what if we have to calculate at one point in time what it would be monthly? We just divide that by 12. Okay.
Divide it by 12. They ask you for that. Yep. All right, number 5 wants us to put it all together pretty much, or pretty close. It says calculate the net operating income of a triplex property. Well, if I know I'm calculating net operating income, let me just stop what I'm doing and go ahead and write out this formula, because I know I'm going to need the whole thing. So what do I start at? Gross potential income minus vacancy. See, I make you repeat it enough, you'll know it, right? And so what does that equal? Gross effective income minus what? Operating expenses. And that's where I give yourself more room, because as we start doing more complex ones, the operating expense line is going to be the one with a lot of stuff on it. So then that equals what? NOI minus the debt service. And that equals before tax cash flow. Or just cash flow. Okay? So now let's go back up here to our question and see what we can fill in here. Here's what they tell us. Calculate the net operating income of a triplex property that is fully rented, with each of the units generating a $750 monthly rental rate. How many units do we have? 3 of them, right? A triplex has 3 units. A duplex has how many? 2. A quadruplex would have 4. You don't need to know anything past that. Thankfully, you don't need to know a quintupleplex or a sextuplex or a septumplex or an octuplex or a novumplex. Isn't that impressive that I still remember all that from Latin?
How many plexes can you go up to?
I could go to a decumplex, an undecumplex, a duodecumplex, and I cannot remember past 12. So.
I was going to say, can you use roll number?
Yeah, useless things you remember. All right, so my gross potential income line, what goes up here? 3 units times what? $750 a month times 12. Okay? And again, I'm not worried about doing the math now. I'll come back and do that later. I'm just making notes for myself. The other thing you can kind of do is mark stuff out in the question once you've dealt with it, right? Because we've dealt with triplex, it's fully rented with each of the units generating $750 rental rate. We're done with that. We've got a 10% annual collection loss. What line does that go on?
Okay.
Vacancy. Vacancy and collection losses are the same thing. So again, just write 10%, make a note. Okay? Mark it out. Done with it. Managed by a broker property manager who charges a 10% management fee. What line is that 10% going on? That's an operating expense. So again, I just write 10%. Don't overcomplicate it. You're just making notes for yourself so you can come back and do all the math. This property has annual repair costs of $800 per unit. Repairs are a what? Operating expense. How many units do we have?
3.
So it's going to be 800 times what? Times 3. Because it says annual repair costs of $800 per unit. Okay? So it's $800 annually per unit. That's 800 times 3. Everybody okay with that? And then annual property taxes on the triplex of $5,600. Property taxes are a what? They're also an operating expense. I'm just going to make a note here. Now I'm ready to come back and actually do my math over on the other side. Is everybody with me and ready? Okay. So over on the left-hand side, gross potential income, I got 3 units times $750 a month times 12 months. That is $27,000 in gross potential income. Okay? Now we're ready for our vacancy. Our vacancy is 10% of that number. So minus how much money? $2,700 for vacancy. And that's going to give us our gross effective income of $24,300. Because it's just simple subtraction. Now we want to start subtracting what? What's our next subtraction line item? Our operating expenses. Always do your management fee first. Okay? Pay yourself first. So, the management fee is 10% of what number? $24,300, because it's 10% of the gross effective income. So that's going to be minus $2,430. All right, how much is our maintenance expense? $2,400. 800 times 3 is 2,400, so that's minus 2,400. And then what do we do with the property taxes? Minus 5,600. Does everybody agree with this setup here for our expenses, our operating expenses? We went from gross potential, subtracted vacancy, that gave us gross effective, and then we just subtracted all of our operating expenses. So now are we ready to get to our NOI? Yep. And so we do 24,300. You got lost where? Talk to me. You got lost after. All right, so you know you got to the gross effective income. What does the formula say we're going to do after gross effective income? Subtract what? Subtract what though? Operating expenses. So what was the first operating expense? 10% management fee. So 10% of what number? There you go. So that's what we got. That's our first subtraction right here. Is our management fee. 20 minus 2430. And then minus, what's our next operating expense? We got to subtract all the operating expenses. Go back to the other side. What was our next operating expense? 800 times 3. It was, because it said $800 per unit. And we had how many units? 3 units. So that was minus $2,400 in maintenance. And then what was the last operating expense they gave us? In property taxes, right? So that's what this minus is. So you're just going to line up all your operating expenses and subtract, subtract, subtract. And once you subtract all your operating expenses, then you're left with your net operating income. Y'all agree with $13,870 as an NOI for this property?
Yes. Can you just like combine all the operation expenses and just take the whole total out?
Sure, if you want to add the operating expenses together and do one subtraction, that's fine. That's fine. If that makes more sense for you, that's absolutely fine. Okay? How do we feel so far about that? See, the formula is meant to help you. That's why you write it out, and so you can align that stuff. All right. You still what?
This ain't gonna form 100% yet.
For what? When you type 800 times, what are you typing in? Talk to me. Don't just tell me what you got. Tell me how you got there. After 24,300? You can't start there, because that's being subtracted from this number.
That's just a management fee. There's only one fee. It's management. You still have two other fees. You got to do the 800.
You've got 3 different operating expenses. And on some of these things, you're going to have 10 different operating expenses. All of the operating expenses have to get subtracted out in that step.
So maybe we better put them all together and then subtract.
Yes. All of these things right here, that's why they're all green. They all go together. They're all the operating expenses. No?
I think it's the math.
They're about to get the trickery going.
I think it's the math on this part that's getting her, because she had to get the 10% and then the 800 times 3, which is 2,400, and then the 600. I was forgetting the math on the work side.
Yeah, maybe better just add them all together.
You okay now?
Yeah.
You good?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. All right. Let's find out. I want you to do number 6. Go for it.
It's hard, got it. It's not hard, it's easy. Got it.
You got to line it down.
Dang, I'm crazy.
Oh, I get it.
No, you don't have to look up there. Watch that word.
Good.
That is good.
It's tricky.
Yes.
It was tricky because I did it and I was like, wait, what did they ask me? Trickery.
Yeah.
I'm working. No.
It's fine. That's just
Yes, can I, yes, so far?
So, go down your vacancy. Go down your vacancy. What you're not gonna do is stop doing all this too much scratch this over here. Slide it over here. And give yourself a collar. Do it just like I did. This is the 487 over here. Slide it over there. Now subtract your vacancy. Subtract it. Subtract it. Okay, we'll take it. And what is that? The gross effective income. There you go. Now, you haven't finished filling in all the information. You shouldn't be doing any math until you fill in all this information. Don't you stop.
It sounds like great.
Got a lot more than I do.
Yeah, but I don't think it's that great, but.
No, you shouldn't be doing any math. You haven't filled in all the information.
But I didn't see an NOI.
Of course you did, because that's what they asked you for. But there are things that we haven't filled in. First of all, reread this line right here.
Monthly maintenance means $3,600.
So why is this 10% on this line? Let me go there. It's an operating expense. It goes on the operating expense. It's calculated based on it's an operating expense.
Oh, but I also did that wrong.
Yes, ma'am. I try to teach you 3,600 times 12. And just stop doing math. Put the notes down. Come back and do the math all at one time.
My hair.
There you go. No one. You debt service. You got that in the right place. You did good. About the property taxes. So I said on that line, property taxes and operating expenses. No, ma'am. Exactly what I go on.
It was like after 12.
Now you're ready to do that. So, what's your next step going to be? That's your most effective. So what can you do? What about this? I don't see any pluses, minuses, equals over here. You just wrote down your letters. It's not all subtraction.
Tell me what you need to talk about.
Okay, well, I need to multiply these two numbers together. And then I get from there, then I get there. Subtract, then figure from there.
Yeah.
And then I need to subtract the 10% from there. And then
10% of what? No, absolutely not. 10% of the gross effective income. Yes.
And then I subtract this figure.
No. And then you'll be cooking. We need to have a lesson on the word monthly. Vacancy and collection losses per month. Monthly maintenance fees, $3,600. So what do you have to do with those? They all got to be multiplied by 12. Everywhere you see monthly. And we didn't ask you for a first tax cash flow. What do we ask you for? And so even on the debt service side, you got that wrong. I'm already $10,000. Oh, there you go again. Pay attention to that first. Yes, they are.
She was killing that calculator. I said, she gonna get that.
No, it's not. It's calculated based on the gross effective income.
Yes. Oh, yeah, you look tired. You concentrate for work. But you keep pushing it. It's gonna add up.
What else do you have? Another operating.
I looked. They were gonna slice it nice, and you see it quick enough. I turned, oh, thanks.
And it takes practice, you'll get better. What you doing? Make a mess?
Yep, I got to fresh.
Okay. So here, I'm gonna tell you one thing I see that you're doing wrong, okay? Don't write this 10% on the gross effective line. I understand that why you want to do that. It is calculated based on the gross effective income, but that management fee is an operating. 10% note should be on the operating expense line. You use the gross effective to calculate it, but it shouldn't go on this line. It goes on this line. Because you got a bunch of them. Alright. Alright.
So let me start
No, you're fine. Yeah, I appreciate it. Appreciate it. What you Alright? I'm going to go through it now, okay? We'll go through the whole thing and show you again how to label it all out and put it in place so that you can see the way, because what I see is some of you have written a formula out and then you just go on haywire and putting stuff wherever you want to anyway, right? The formula is a guide for where to put the things. So, the other thing is, and I know you want to so badly, don't pick up the calculator until you have written everything down, because that is a surefire way to get lost with where you were and make a mistake with this stuff. You need to put all these numbers in place and then pick up the calculator and do the math. Is everybody okay with that? All right. So look at the information they gave us. All right, up here, folks. All right, everybody needs to be watching. Gross potential income of $487,000. So I'm just making notes for myself. I'm not doing any math. They gave me the number. I don't need to do any math. Thank you. I appreciate it. Vacancy and collection losses of $64.80 per month. So I'm going to write $64.80 times what?
12.
Times 12, because it says per month. The next one. Annual property management fee of 10% of the gross effective income. This was a very common mistake that I saw. Most of you, or not most of you, some of you put this 10% on the gross effective income line. No, it is an operating expense. Does that make sense? Put your notation for it on the operating expense line. That way you won't forget how to handle it. So, the first operating expense we have is the 10% management fee. Monthly maintenance fees. What line is that going to go on? That's also an operating expense, and it's $3,600 times what?
12.
Times 12. And then debt service. Don't try to ignore it. That's outsmarting the formula. Fill it in. I realize we may not need it, but fill it in. Let the formula do the work for you. Debt service of $21,500 monthly. Well, that goes down here, and it would be times what? 12, because it's monthly. And then one that a lot of you just ignored because you quit, I don't know what you did, was that last one, the property taxes. What are property taxes? They are an operating expense. So, put them on the operating expense line. $38,000. Can't write. $38,950. All right. Now that I've got everything notated, it's time to do math. Okay? And I'm just going to flip over to the other side. Do I need to do any math on the gross potential income line? No. Nope. Just bring it over. $487,000. Do I need to do math on the vacancy line? Yes. I need to do that 6480 times 12. And that gives me vacancy of $77,760. Everybody agree with that number for our vacancy? Now, can I calculate my gross effective income? Yes, because that's going to be my gross potential minus my vacancy. So my gross potential, I come up with $409,240 for a gross effective. Is everybody okay with that?
Wait, please. Yes.
All right. What is the next step after you've got your gross effective? Start subtracting your what? Your operating expenses. So now go back to my notes over there. What's the first operating expense I have in my notes? My 10% fee. And it's 10% of what number? The gross effective income. So that's going to be minus $40,924. Okay? So I've done the first operating expense. Everybody all right? There's no need for me to do that math yet because I got other operating expenses. If you want to do it, that's fine, but it'll get confusing for you because then you got to start trying to pick out where your net operating income is. I recommend you just stack them in a line. Or total them all together, as Marlo said. Whatever makes more sense for you guys. All right? What other operating expenses do we have?
The maintenance.
The maintenance. So we need to take out that $3,600 times 12. I came up with $43,200. Does everybody agree with that? You had $43.20 because you left off a zero. And then we got one more operating expense. There's property taxes of $38,950. And so now we're ready to calculate our NOI, and I came up with $286,166. And that's my stopping point because they asked me for what? For the NOI. If I had continued and had subtracted the debt out, what would I actually have calculated? But what is that called? Those of you that went further, that's called the cash flow. And here's the thing, on the test, that's going to be an answer choice. That number that you calculated for before tax cash flow is going to be an answer choice on the test because they expect you to know where to stop. Okay? It's really important to know where to stop. Don't get carried away. Oh, of course they will. I guarantee. So here's the answer choice that's going to be on there. 409,240 is going to be an answer choice. 286,166 is going to be an answer choice. Whatever the before tax cash flow is going to be an answer choice. They're going to probably have an answer choice that lines up with only doing $3,600 in maintenance versus $3,600 times 12. So, you got to be real careful with it. Everybody all right with that? All right? I want you to do the same thing on the next one. And we're going to do the same thing on number 7. Now, those of you that wanted to go all the way, this is your question, because this one goes all the way. Yes, ma'am. There is no month running out. Interesting. I'll let you deal with that. Something tells me if you write the formula out and fill in all the information, you'll recognize that you might not need it. I didn't mean that in a smart way. Don't you rule me. It was.
Okay, I got the answer from the last one that we just went over.
Mhm.
In the midst of my chicken scratch that you said.
Yeah.
Like I did something, I think
See, if you can't tell what you did, that means you're not labeling things clearly enough. But here's your problem with this machine. You're writing it down because I told you right now. You're not writing it down for the right reasons. You're not actually using it as labels. These are line items. Keep them lined up so that you know what you're doing.
Okay.
In other words, in your mind, you should be seeing this. These are all separate, like this. You see what I'm saying? You know? If you can keep them visually separated, then they'll be mentally separated. Okay? So work on the next one. Write out the formula, and then fill in the notes before you even try to do any math. Write the formula down the middle, so you can write eight on one side and half on the other. Difficult line, give yourself some room. You can keep them visually separated. What times multiplied plus what?
It's gonna be subtracted.
Within 100.
Right.
Minus, labels. How hard is that? No. That's why we do it, because that's not minus. This minus this. Figure it out. So now what? Next. It's not minus.
But I thought it was subtracted.
This minus this equals. So write equals.
Yes. Okay.
What? Without it. Start. What about it? Yes. Got it. Yeah.
BTCF.
Got it. Yes. So now it actually tells you what to do. Now it's actually a formula. Gross potential income minus vacancy equals gross vacancy. Minus operating expenses equals net operating expenses. Minus debt equals before tax cash flow. Okay? Let me run through the numbers real quick now.
First off,
I
you
did.
gotta take it for it.
You this time.
Because there's a space here, and there's not gonna go into other GPOs.
Have you started any of the answers in your formula and worked down from there? Like, what would be the next answer if you weren't gonna have the GPI, the next one?
So they
Right,
start
and what's that?
the GER.
And you have that number?
Yeah.
So can you calculate everything below that?
When you say that the starting point has to be on a GPI?
If you don't have the information below, you would have to have that to get the information below. Or tricking you.
Okay.
And I wrote it too, very dotted.
Start halfway. Start halfway. Go back.
Figure out what the questions are.
Okay. They started you halfway. Why do you care about all this stuff? So the only reason you need this and this is to get this, right? They already gave it. Start from there.
Oh, that's a really okay. So can you calculate out?
That's right. Oh,
Start there.
good. What you got?
You have to fill it all in, and then go back and figure out where you want to start. That's what's tricky on where, what you need.
You got it, man. You got it. You really drop it out. It looks like to me everything else is correct. Obviously, property management is going way off. But you bet nobody needs $370,000 to it. Down over here.
I'm working.
No problem, Tom.
It's more too fast. There's septic. So, you know, I see
So when you calculate the 9%, and you start weighing those numbers over here, so you calculated this, right? Bring that number over there. Bring that
excise tax, I messed that one up. Test, I
here.
around. I looked at that for 500 now. If I looked at what I looked at, I knew it was
Now, bring in these things over, so minus what? 9%, now calculate that. Right. So that's how it's minus. So you know what to do with it. Remember, it's minus operating. The other number over here as well.
This could be a lot, but
Just put it down underneath.
the onboarding of this one people is, and I'm adding a percent again.
exactly what we do, they're all minuses, right?
Right.
And then once you take this number and you subtract these two numbers, it's like gonna give you equals the NOI. Good. Yeah, I was gonna say, you just gotta start keying here or something. Your math is all like, what do you guys, you all right over there?
Yeah. It's all good. She did those now. Hang on. Huh? I said she took our demo. She's taking out ours.
Right there. Okay, alright. You got everything set up correctly, right? Run that number again. 4,440 minus the 2 months. That's your NOI. Yeah. That's 154, 680, you should be good. That's where you start to joke.
Okay.
At least I know that one and maybe the whole. No, it's not this, because I know this one, this part of it.
What's this number on this?
I like numbers, so number good.
Minus 396 minus 62. Just type this down here.
What's wrong? Huh? Yeah.
That should be your NOI right there. Correct. Here's my question. Why are you jumping back over there? You know your math. Why not just put key costs and put it right there on the, why are you jumping back and forth Well, then why don't you start putting these notes on the left-hand side when the math and the
Did you think about that?
Yes, I did. All right, everybody come up with it. I think I looked at everybody's $3,813,720.
I want that piece of property.
You want that piece of property? That's a pretty good one.
That's a good.
That is a pretty good one. All right. So you guys have the, the rest of this packet for your homework. That's kind of giving you one of everything. Take a deep breath. let it clear out. And we're not done with that formula by any stretch of the imagination. We're going to continue to use that formula through the rest of the class, but we're going to take a stop for just a second. I'll go back to the slides and finish up this chapter, okay? Show me what? Don't show me. All right, so just a few more notes here about property management and things that property managers should pay attention to, okay? These 4 things dictate how much rent you charge, and all of them are important. It's not one or the other, it's all of them. Should you charge enough to cover the operating expenses? Yes. Yes. Should the rental income provide a return on the owner's investment?
Yes.
Yes, most definitely. Do you have to look at other comparable properties in your area to determine your pricing?
Yes.
Yes, that's part of it as well. And then you got to look at your vacancy. Now I'm going to tell you about vacancy, folks. Vacancy is not necessarily the devil. It can be, but you really don't want 100% occupancy when you're managing a lot of property. 100% occupancy when you're managing a lot of property means you're not charging enough. Simple as that. If you're managing 100 units and every single one of them is occupied, you're the sucker. Because you should be charging what? More rent. You'd rather have 95 of them occupied at a higher rent than 100 of them occupied at the lower rent. So some small amount of vacancy is actually a good idea as a property manager. Does that make sense for everybody? And it's not just that you do better with the rent. It also gives you an opportunity to do maintenance on the units, to turn them, to do improvements on them, because you always have some that are available. Think of it, if you're 100% occupied, when are you going to upgrade your units? When are you going to do any kind of maintenance? It's almost impossible. Whereas if you're running 95% occupancy and you've always got a little float, you can keep yourself busy about fixing them up, getting them ready for the next tenant. Okay? Alright, so you definitely want to keep an eye on the vacancy, but don't focus so much on having 100% occupancy. Duties or typical duties of a property manager. You're probably going to see test questions that relate to what would a property manager typically be responsible for. And these are the things that I think they would show up on a test. Marketing the property, selecting the tenants. It is the property manager's job to choose the tenant, not the landlord's job. It's one of the biggest functions of a property manager, to choose what tenants you accept. Collecting the rent, obviously. Maintaining the property with maintenance. Going to court. If you have to file a summary ejectment, who's going to be filing it? The property manager is. Not the landlord, the property manager. And then complete all the accounting and bookkeeping, which is what we just worked on. Those are all functions of a typical property manager. How about on a test if they say things like reinvesting the profits? Would that be a typical duty of a property manager?
No.
No, it's not your profit to reinvest. It's their money. So nothing to do with anything. Once it turns into before tax cash flow, you turn it over to them. That's the long and short of that. Different types of maintenance. Just be sure you're aware of the difference between preventative maintenance and corrective maintenance. Which one's more cost effective? Preventative. Corrective is repairs. It's fixing something that's already broken. And that is very cost inefficient. Preventative maintenance is much more cost efficient over the long run than corrective maintenance is. And you definitely don't want to get into a situation of having a lot of deferred maintenance. What does deferred maintenance mean? You're putting it off and not doing it, and so therefore the condition of the property is deteriorating. And if you allow that to go on, what's that going to do to your revenue stream? It's going to drop in a number of ways, because you're going to lose tenants. Does that make sense? And are you going to have more corrective maintenance to do because you've deferred doing the preventative maintenance? Yep, so it's going to kill you in the long run to have a bunch of deferred maintenance. Just a reminder what your employees can do. If you are a broker property manager, you can have a salaried employee, and they can perform almost any task for you. They can collect rent, They can schedule appointments, they can schedule maintenance, they can meet with tenants, they can show properties that are for sale. They can't, for lease, they can't show properties that are for sale. Sorry about that. They can show properties for lease, but not properties for sale. Can they balance a trust account?
Yes.
Yeah, can they deposit money in the trust account? Absolutely. They can do all those things. They can't negotiate. So if a tenant comes in and wants to talk about renewing their lease, that unlicensed person can only tell them what's printed on the page in front of them. They can say, well, my understanding is you can renew your lease at this amount, because they've already been given that information. Does that make sense? What if the tenant says, well, I was thinking more like $1,200 a month. What should the unlicensed person do at that point? Say, you got to talk to the property manager. I can't have that conversation with you. So they cannot negotiate in any way. Can't negotiate or solicit, and can't show things that are for sale. Last slide here in the property management section, the Americans with Disabilities Act. This is a law that you would pretty much only encounter in commercial real estate settings. This law does not apply to residential properties. That's what the Fair Housing Act is for. This law applies to places of public accommodation. Is this building a place of public accommodation? Yes, it absolutely is. So any type of public facility, offices, shopping centers, restaurants, hotels would all fall under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The Americans with Disabilities Act is pretty straightforward. It says that you must provide an equal level of access regardless of disability. Now, it goes on to say that that access can be accomplished in one of two ways. Either with an accommodation for the person or a modification to the property. So you need to know the difference between the word accommodation and modification. An accommodation is changing the way you do business. It's making an exception. Does that make sense? A modification is actually physically altering the structure. So an elevator would be which? A modification. Installing an elevator would be a modification. An accommodation might be, for example, let's say tenant comes in who is handicapped. They're wheelchair bound. You are running an apartment complex. Tenant comes in who is wheelchair bound, and you have 2 available units in the complex. And there are no elevators in the complex. All of your buildings are 3 floors and there are no elevators. One unit that's available is a ground floor unit in a very desirable building because it backs up to the pool. The other that's available is a second floor unit, and these are 3-story buildings, so the second floor units are going to be by far the least desirable, right? They call them the sandwich units, because you're in the middle, you got to hear people below you and above you, right? So it's in the middle, second floor of one of the least desirable buildings in the whole place because it backs up to the dumpster. Is there probably going to be a difference in pricing between those 2 units?
Yes.
Yes. Is the ground floor unit that backs up to the pool probably going to be marketed at a higher price?
Yes.
Yes. However, that handicapped person does not have the luxury of taking either of those units. They have to take which one? The ground unit, because it's the only one that will accommodate them. So how can you make an accommodation for that person?
You lower the rent.
You lower the rental rate on that ground unit to what you would have charged for the what? For the second floor unit. That would be an example of an accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Now, how does a person know, like, if there is a person that's handicapped that needs a downstairs unit, and they actually do have one, they say they don't.
What do you mean?
I mean, like, someone comes to me having, and they see that the person needs a downstairs unit, and they say they don't have one. How do we know that they don't, that they actually do have one?
Well, it's not our job to police it, but what I've found is usually they're pretty open about what inventory they have. They'll say, well, we have this, and we have this, and this is the price, and this is the price. Well, once you say, well, I can't use the second floor unit, at that point, they should be willing to drop the price on the first floor unit.
They can be busted pretty easily. You just just have your friend call and they give a different answer.
If they give a different answer, that's certainly going to put them in a tough position. Yeah.
Do they get any, like, can they write the difference off on taxes or something?
Well, it's just it's a loss. It comes out in that formula as a loss, right? It's a collection loss. It's cost of doing business. So, now, what I have seen some property managers do is get very creative. If, let's say they have somebody else who's in a top floor unit, which, you know, or I'm sorry, somebody else who's in a lower floor unit in a less desirable building, but their lease is up for renewal and they're wavering about whether to renew. Could they contact that person and say, I tell you what, if you renew, we'll move you to this building over here by the pool at your same rental amount, and free up the lower floor unit in the less desirable building for the handicapped person? They could, I mean, they could get creative like that as long as they're making some type of an accommodation. Like an accommodation, for example, if I called Ivy tomorrow and said, Ivy, we don't have enough handicap parking spaces. I mean, we routinely have 5 or 6 people in our classes who are wheelchair bound, and there's only 4 handicap spots out there. What would be a good example of an accommodation that could be made? Simply mark another space as handicap. Does that make sense? You're not changing the property, you're just changing the way you operate the property. That would be an accommodation. Whereas a modification would be, what's one modification you've noticed at hotels recently in recent years? If you go outside to the pool, what have you noticed at the pool? That lift, right? Every hotel pool you see now has that hydraulic lift installed for ADA access. That's a modification that you see at every hotel now. Like a ramped entrance into the pool. Yep, yep, I've seen that as well. Yeah. Yeah, than the lift thing. Okay, so everybody good on the difference between? Now, I'm going to give you one note. It doesn't show up on the exam, but I'm just going to point it out because I don't want to see you get in trouble. Service animals are abused terribly. I hate it, but it happens. Here's the thing. Stop trying to be the police for it. It's not your job. You're only going to get yourself in trouble. It's not your job to figure out if that animal is a service animal. If somebody presents to you and says this is a service animal, under the ADA, the first thing you can do is look at the animal and see if it's one of 2 things. A dog or a miniature horse. Because they're the only 2 things that the ADA specifies have to be allowed as service animals. So if they got a cat and they say this is my service animal, do you have to allow it? You do not. Now that's different than the Fair Housing Act. If we're talking about residential property, the Fair Housing Act doesn't specify species. So a cat, bat, a rat, a snake, any of it works. Okay? But for the ADA, it's dogs and miniature horses. If they have a dog and they say this is my service animal, first of all, you should probably just admit the thing as a service animal and move on with your life. That's going to be the least likely way to get yourself sued, okay? If you really want to press the issue, you're only allowed to ask 2 questions. Here are the 2 questions. Do you have a disability? That's question number 1. Notice I did not ask, what is the disability? What's wrong with you? You look fine to me. None of that. A simple, do you have a disability? It's a yes or no question. They don't have to tell you what the disability is. If they say, yes, I do have a disability, then you can ask question number 2. Is the animal trained to assist you with that disability? Again, that's a yes or no question. Can you ask for verification? Can you ask for some certification? Can you ask where the animal went to school? None of that. You can't even ask what it is that the animal does for them. You can simply ask, do you have a disability, and is the animal trained to provide you with assistance? If they say yes to both of those questions, folks, that's a service animal. And service animals are not pets, so pet rules don't apply to service animals. Does that make sense to everybody? Well, no, well, remember, that would be fair housing. That doesn't go under ADA because you're talking about fair housing when you talk about pet deposits. And not, but yes, you're correct. If it's a service animal, you would not charge a pet deposit. But right now we're talking about public facilities, so we're talking about basically accommodating. So if I had somebody who came to class with their dog, and clearly we don't allow pets in class, but I asked them, do you have a disability? Yes. Is a dog trained to provide you assistance with a disability? Yes. Then I have to allow the animal as a service animal. Simple as that. Okay? I don't want to see you get in trouble about it. I love my dogs too, but I don't want to take them everywhere. It would be like a menagerie with my three. Holy moly. Can't even imagine. Yes, ma'am.
Do you find that there are people that will abuse this?
Very routinely. Yes, routinely. I did find it interesting, the lady who tried to board an airplane with her service peacock earlier this year, and she was denied. And she was denied, and the airline was well within their rights to deny her, because again, that's an ADA thing, and the ADA specifies what?
Miniature.
Dogs and miniature horses, so they don't have to accommodate a service peacock. And her response was, she said, well, my landlord said it was a service animal, and is it a service animal with her landlord?
Yes.
Yes, because that's fair housing. But when you go into a public place, they do not have to accommodate that animal because it's not a dog or a miniature horse.
So if she had a miniature horse as a service animal,
I'm sorry?
if she had a miniature horse,
If she had a miniature horse, then they would have to accommodate the miniature horse.
how would they accommodate?
Give it a seat.
They gonna put a $69.
You give it a seat?
Would she have to pay to get a ticket?
No,
Oh, no ticket?
no ticket. They give it a seat.
What if they were full?
You
How is a
gonna get on
horse
for that
going
with
to
you, you gotta come
A
back.
miniature horse is about the size of a Saint Bernard. This is a big
Sit
dog.
up like a person.
They do. They sit up in the seat like a person. They do. Yeah. Yeah, and they have harnesses, you know. Listen, you're not going to have to worry about somebody abusing it with a miniature horse. Number one, those things are ungodly expensive. Like if you go out and you buy a miniature horse for a service, I mean, those people spend like $30,000 on that animal.
Wow.
And so, you know, if somebody's got a service horse, get out of their way. They know what they're doing. You know, like if somebody comes in with their Chihuahua, you know, that's the one you have to, you know, like really. But don't do that, okay? Don't do that. You get yourself in trouble. Just ask the 2 questions and move on with your life.
Because it could be providing some sort of emotional.
You can't,
Right.
yeah, right.
It helps your disability, that's all.
That's right.
Right.
That's right. You
So
know.
you're saying, on the Fair Housing Act and the American Disability Act, if a animal is a service animal, they cannot charge.
Correct. That is correct, because it's not a pet. You treat, for purposes of those kinds of things, you treat a service animal like a human. So if
They
you,
have to pay like a deposit for like, you know, like when it goes.
you can't charge a deposit for a human either,
Yeah, I'm
so.
gonna say, we gonna charge them a ticket, 'cause they gonna
Well,
charge
you know, you
ticket
have
for
to do a background check or something.
All right, that's it for chapter 13. Let's take a break, come back at 9 o'clock.
you. They ain't just charging it all first, they just charging the fees.
Hey, Travis, do you have more cash flow?
I have all the cash flow in the world.
Oh, go ahead, big dog.
Can I get some more cash flow?
Yeah, put it all like
Train the bar, get her medicine.
The problem is it flows the wrong direction.
Yeah.
It all flows down.
Airline thing that you can't really
You got the last one?
I got the little thing and everything, she's like, this is my first one. And they demanded
Some of them, yeah. How to,
Michelle, did you get that?
It's a lady in Chapel Hill.
I wanna show you something.
I got it.
I wanna show you the trick, okay?
My problem has always been, like,
The lady in Chapel Hill, she buys Jordans.
okay, you need to sit down and show me.
He does. He wears Jordans and he sits in the front seat of the van and she goes,
Oh,
she
I'm gonna
flies.
get it too.
And so with Chapel Hill Transit, you know, they have a pickup service. And so she calls the Chapel Hill Transit to come pick her up and take her out to dinner. And the horse gets in the front seat, he straps him in, he's got a little harness that hooks him to the seatbelt, he sits right in the front seat. And then when they get to the restaurant, he gets out, he goes and stands beside the door and waits for her to get out. He knows the restaurant, he knows the, you know, it's crazy. He's awesome. He's awesome. And the other thing they're really good for, other than vision assistance, is people that need like support, like because they put like that harness on them that's like really tightly strapped, and it's like they can push up on it, and if they fall down, it's like a cane, but much better, yeah, right. And if they fall, the horse is trained to get in front of them, like right beside them, so they can push up on it and like they flop over it to help them go down. It's really amazing.
When one of my patients years ago asking to get them to assist, we will get service at dogs.
Right.
The dogs mount kids. When they ask for a horse, I was like, listen, I know her.
Right.
When she went to my boss, and I told her, she actually asked for a horse. She said, I do not know that.
Yeah, they're awesome.
I can get a horse. I mean, she spends thousands.
Oh, yeah. Well, and it's such a cool idea because you think about it, they live so much longer than a dog. And, you know, and so this person is, I mean, think of how bonded we are with our animals. This person is 100 times more bonded and dependent on this animal. So you take something that's got a 3 times the working lifespan of a dog, they can go 20 years and use the same horse. And so it's awesome, really.
There's still one of them that passed away, the child passed away, but the other one still has the horse. It's just a big word at the end, you know, you got festival for lips,
Yeah.
and the horse climbs up.
Goes right in the back, yeah.
Sits next to the wheelchair.
Yeah, they're great.
She had an older one, right? We need a better one. So my husband and I were take fairgrounds, they put some
So see, we got it on here.
stuff like that. All we know just we delivered one for her something up there for
The work. And I wasn't putting my insurance in my mind.
make sure that
No, I didn't realize. Travis came up here with my
she gets old.
Forget it. So right here, you don't have enough, it's just like the letter. It means nothing.
break it down.
So, good.
Make it different than
And that's gonna give you a
the GEF,
all right, what you do.
the gross effective income.
Okay. Now, I gotta do what?
The OPEX,
I gotta do what?
subtract the OPEX, the operating expenses,
Okay, then that's
the net operating income, the mortgage.
If they, yeah, both, they need mortgage or what?
I think they say, oh, yes,
We were visiting
the before tax cash flow.
in my car, you know, we parked in the handicap place. And I know in this guy comes up and he gets right in my face and I jumped out.
Then it said, I know I gotta find what name.
The big cat. This guy, like, his face was red, and I go, just a second, sir. He said, you can yell at me. Just a second, you can yell at me just a second. So as he's yelling at me, bring up and down. I go to my bag and I open my stomach. What's in the back of my car?
Subtract.
A wheelchair.
Yeah.
So I'm pulling this wheelchair up in his face, so that was bright red, white dress. Just a second, sir, I'm helping my friend out. You know, she's frail, she's got 2 surgeries. So I'm helping her out of the car, and she's got her canes and there's something. And I go, oh, this is just, and I go with this, and I says, okay, sir, now what did you, because he was, trying to leave, he was trying to back away like this. I said, so, I said, tell me about it's such a shame or something. He goes, and she's like, with shakes and stuff, and she's trying to sit down and stuff. She's holding over. Exactly. And I said,
The 49.6.
Yeah.
The property.
and he goes, well, sorry, ma'am.
That's also what?
Well, I think it's like, if it was
Also what?
The operating expenses.
assess the situation.
Yeah.
Go crazy.
Maintenance fee. 3,600 monthly times 12. Read you. Oh, the property taxes. Those are all your operating expenses, 123,074. Which I didn't even get that. Right. Yeah. More than that, and it will be. It's 123,71. We're gonna take that back over here, plug that in, subtract that from the previous figure that they got, from the 409.12. That's the gross effective income. And you're gonna give them net operating income. The answer. $286,166. Right, and see, look, I put that down.
Well, it didn't matter, right? Because it didn't matter because that's not what it was.
They wanted the net operating.
Always, so you can go through, you see what I did? This is what I read when you do it. All the this was important because this is what?
The chart, please. Sure.
I'm almost missed that. Let's go on with it.
Yeah. Right.
Trickery. That was in what? So you gotta get it. This one, yeah. First it should be, because I can share, right? Radio people. So let's do number 7.
I got completely confused because there's so much.
So let's, so first of all, let's do all that. Let's take the out, right? Then come on the corner.
But I'm also.
No, and you'll follow them.
Oh, right now, what do you mean?
I want you.
I don't know what it means.
It's a trip that someone could just bring a dog in and say,
Oh, I know.
you know, that this is a service animal and that. I understand that you don't want to challenge that because it's a big
So we're gonna subtract.
trouble
So
out
we're
there.
gonna,
But
we're gonna like to do subtract.
it's a trip.
What is that gonna
Just
make?
make up
That's gonna make what?
my little parrot, you know.
What is it gonna be?
GEI.
So what after that, we're gonna do subtract what?
Okay. Operating.
I make a line, you can do math on that. So we make the math on that, we're simple.
You know, yeah.
So the service is in what? Put that on the slash, the service line. They gonna do math from that, minus what? So it'll be what? Equal sign. What is that? Listen,
Facility and then.
the performance, okay, so under.
No, I filled it in, but I'm doing.
So now. What else is it?
There's stuff that don't
What
have,
is it?
100 unit apartment building, the 8% vacancy, you don't need gross effective income. 370,000. Right here. Right here. Right here. The letters.
We don't know yet, so we're gonna figure it out.
And the,
Nope.
But that's not lining up with the GCIs.
Underneath it?
No, it doesn't matter. No, we ain't gonna do it right.
Yeah, that's not.
So now we got how many
The work.
Don't worry about that.
Chapter 13.